What if Vladimir Putin wasn't the real problem? What if his rampant, ruthless reign over Russia was only the inevitable end result of a society that has been allowed to rot and fester for decades before he even came to power? Well, that would mean that even if Putin disappeared overnight, Russia wouldn't simply switch to some sort of normal state. Someone else would simply step up to take the president's place, and the chaos we've seen in the last few years would continue. It's a grim scenario, but honestly, it might be the most accurate one we've got. Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Domino Effect, the channel where we map the wars, the weapons, and the power struggles shaping our world, one falling domino at a time. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today we're taking a deep dive into Russian culture, society, and history, exploring the many dominoes that fell throughout the ages to form the Russian Federation we know today. Let's get into it. People like to blame Putin for everything Russia does wrong, and that's logical. He is the president, after all, and has essentially made himself a dictator by rewriting Russia's constitution in order to remain in power year after year, decade after decade. There's something easy and comfortable about looking at the war in Ukraine and seeing Putin as the big bad guy, the final boss the West needs to defeat in order for Russia to at last see sense and plot a course for more peaceful interactions with its neighbors and the wider world. But while that might make for a nice, neat plot in a Hollywood movie, the real world tends to be much more complicated. Even though Putin absolutely deserves the lion's share of the blame for what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world today, honestly, the Russian president did not simply rise up out of nowhere. Maria Domanska, senior fellow at the Warsaw-based Center for Eastern Studies, puts it like this. Of course, Putin is responsible as the principal perpetrator, but neither Putin nor a handful of people like him could have created such a system without a very particular social foundation. Putin's rule was, to a very large extent, a response to the specific beliefs, fears, and expectations of Russian society, a society deeply scarred by the difficult history of the 20th century. To understand how Putin, a mid-level operative with an unremarkable early career, took control of the world's largest nation, we have to trace the pattern back to its root, the rise of the Russian Empire. Unlike sea-based empires such as the British, Russia built a massive continental empire, steadily absorbing adjacent lands across one continuous landmass to eventually cover a sixth of the globe. And because of the way it formed, it didn't even feel like an empire as such. It felt like one vast country, simply getting bigger and stronger with every passing year, soaking up sections of Siberia, the Caucasus, and beyond. People born in that empire were brought up to believe they were special, that they were part of the greatest nation that had ever existed. And that's a key word, greatest. Greatness has been synonymous with Russian culture and identities for centuries, all the way back to the days of the empire. From Russia's leaders and elites, right down to the lowliest of peasants, all were conditioned throughout their lives to feel as though their nation was great, primarily because it was so large. Size equals power, and that underlying idea has persisted right up to the modern era. Sergei Lebedev, a Russian writer and journalist, perfectly illustrated this point when he sat down for an interview with OSW and described the inspiring sight of the Soviet Union map on his childhood classroom wall. I had this feeling of awe, uncritical awe. Here was something enormous. To be Russian, raised in Russia, made in Russia, means above all to imagine yourself as part of something very large, and not really understanding what it means to belong to a small nation, to belong to something so immense that, conventionally speaking, it can neither be contained nor destroyed. To be part of something powerful, something superior. Interesting quote, huh? And that's another interesting word, superior. There's nothing wrong with people being proud of their countries, but the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union that followed went much further than that. It encouraged its inhabitants to feel exceptional and superior to those from other smaller nations. They were bigger, ergo, they were better. The entire Russian national identity was, in effect, built around ideas of imperial power and expansion. And even though individual citizens might not have had all that much agency or even amazing lives by most metrics, they were still able to feel like they were a part of this great story, of this grand, all-conquering country that couldn't be stopped, restricted, or repelled by any other nation on Earth. Over time, with enough repetition from generation to generation, that sort of mindset becomes baked into the very essence of what it is to be a Russian. And that makes it much easier for the country's leaders to justify even the most horrendous of actions. So here comes Domino 2. With the empire established and the Russian population brainwashed to believe they were a superior race, those in the highest positions of power were given free rein to invade more and more neighboring nations, stealing their land and taking their resources with impunity. Except they didn't phrase it that way. Empires rarely do. They don't see themselves as conquering forces bullying other countries into bending to their will. Instead, they see themselves as liberators, saviors, or teachers. And it was the same in Russia. As other territories were taken over, Russian leaders and people believed that they were doing these places a favor. They weren't ransacking their lands and robbing them of their resources. They were bringing the beauty and benefits of great Russian culture to the unwashed masses, and those masses should be grateful. It may sound ludicrous to our modern ears, or actually, maybe it doesn't. Either way, this is the way that many historic empires operated, and Russia was particularly strident in its belief that its people were the chosen ones, and that other nations they invaded should count themselves lucky for the privilege of being part of such an exceptional empire. Understanding this is vital for understanding everything that follows, right up to the war in Ukraine, because this line of thinking ran right through century after century into the formation of the Soviet Union and beyond. Even during the USSR's heyday, Russia never saw itself on any sort of equal footing with the republics around it, even though it may have been called a union of Soviet socialist republics. It was still the center of the world, the sun around which the other Soviet nations orbited, the most important cog in the machine. And so, when the Soviet Union fell, Domino 3, Russia had a very different view compared to the rest of the world. The rest of the world saw borders change and independent states emerge. But even though imperial institutions were weakened, the imperial attitudes that had been so deeply ingrained in the Russian psyche largely remained. Now, that doesn't mean every Russian was going around saying that the USSR should still exist, but many still felt as though the nations that had once been united with them, like Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Belarus, Armenia, Georgia, and others, were still and would forever be intertwined with the newly formed Russian Federation. This is how the concept of the so-called near abroad formed. It's a term Putin has used many times, a way to describe the former Soviet republics not as fully sovereign, independent nations, but as former territories that still exist within Russia's sphere of influence and form part of a single, historically connected landmass. Ever since the USSR fell, Russia may have accepted that states like Georgia and Ukraine exist on maps and official documents, but has still resisted the idea that they have genuine autonomy and the real freedom to choose their political and cultural pathways. In short, they're allowed their independence, but only as long as it aligns with Moscow's own ideas, which always supersede everything else. And in order to ensure that the Russian population, by and large, doesn't deviate from these views it has been brainwashed with for so many decades, the Kremlin takes things up a notch. It begins to weaponize its own history. Plenty of countries have slightly selective memories when it comes to their own pasts. They often prefer to focus on their historical achievements and successes, kind of sweeping some of those darker moments under the rug. In the modern era, however, many nations have at least been able to face some of the harsher realities of their history and acknowledge that they got things wrong from time to time. Russia hasn't really done that. Instead, especially under Putin, Russia has largely ignored its more problematic memories and amped up its successes beyond belief. The perfect example of this is the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War as Russians tend to call it. The war isn't just a historical event for Russia. It's arguably the cornerstone on which the modern Russian identity has been built. In schools across the country, in parades, in speeches and solemn celebrations, Russians are taught and reminded and reinforced of the idea that it was their country that defeated the greatest and most absolute evil the world had ever seen, the Nazis. Thanks to that, Russia occupies an exclusive moral high ground over the rest of the world. And if ever Nazism dares to rear its ugly head again, it will be up to Russia to rise up and defeat it. This, again, ties into the war that's raging today. In giving the order to invade Ukraine, Putin repeatedly emphasized that Russian forces were being dispatched on a so-called special military operation to combat what he called Nazism in the neighboring state. This allowed him to earn the backing of a relatively large part of the population, who had spent their entire lives believing that when Russia goes to war, it's only for reasons that are right and just, regardless of what the rest of the world says. And so we're coming to Domino 4, or what I like to call the missing Nuremberg. Most empires had a clear post-imperial reckoning, in which they were made to face up to the mistakes they'd made. The United Kingdom had to think deeply about what the British Empire had done to the wider world. So did France. Germany, too, had its reckoning following World War II when the victorious Allies forced the country to confront the horrific crimes committed under the Nazi regime and actively punish those responsible through the Nuremberg trials. Russia didn't have this. When the Russian Empire ended, Russian students weren't sitting in classrooms debating the ethics of their imperial past. Similarly, when the Soviet Union fell, there wasn't a big Russia-wide reckoning over how the country had treated its nearest neighbors for so many years. And that matters, because it's only via these kinds of reckonings that countries actually establish a clear border between then and now. Only through them can they clearly see the errors of the old system and want to build something different and better as they move onward. Because Russia hasn't had that. Many institutions and ideas from Russia's Soviet and imperial past remain today, and many people look back at their country's past with a sense of longing and a desire for those glory days to return. That's where Domino 5, Putin himself, enters the arena. As I mentioned back at the start of the video, Putin wasn't a particularly outstanding individual as a young man. He joined the KGB, but it's not like he rose through the ranks at lightning speed. He spent most of the time in sort of a middle management role, not standing out or excelling in any particular way. He was, however, a man with an uncanny ability to tap into Russian culture and history. Like so many of his countrymen, he too had been raised to believe that Russia had been the greatest empire on earth, and could be again. He also believed that the former Soviet republics would have been better off remaining united with Russia, and hoped to live to see the day when something like that would come to pass. He wasn't alone in these beliefs. He wasn't an outlier or exception. He was merely a symptom of a society that had been obsessed with itself and its own alleged greatness for centuries. And once he entered politics, all he really did was tell people what they wanted to hear, by telling them what he himself would have liked to hear. He offered a sense of order after the chaos of the Soviet breakup. He offered strength and greatness after what many felt was a moment of humiliation and decline. He offered unity. He offered certainty in the face of fragmentation. And perhaps, most important of all, he promised to restore Russia to its former glory. That message resonated, and it's one that Putin has clung to throughout his entire time in power. It's never about looking forward and building a newer, different future with him. It's always been about looking back and restoring Russia to its rightful place, bringing back its strength, its respect, and its status. Of course, Russian people aren't just one homogenous hive mind. They don't all feel the same way and express the same beliefs, despite the similar conditions in which they're raised. There are plenty of different points of view across the population, but Putin's propaganda empire never needed to win them all over. He just had to convince the masses to take his side and ensure that everyone else remained passive enough not to cause disruption. That's where his particular branch of strongman politics has proven so useful. Through repression, censorship, othering, and similar techniques, Putin has, year after year, instilled feelings of fear, cynicism, and helplessness among those who might defy him. Russians who dare to deviate from the norm have been made to feel that the system is far too powerful for them to ever change. They've been conditioned to feel like anomalies, so that even if they wanted to speak up, they're too fearful to do so, believing that everyone else around them would disagree and shout them down. And so, like worker ants, they go mindlessly about their business, withdrawing into their own little bubbles, living with apathy and conformity, leaving those at the top free to do whatever they want. That is the heart of what is wrong with Russian society today. So much of the population buys into Putin's propaganda, and even those who don't simply don't care enough to do anything against it. They may not all love the state. In fact, many distrust it. But they also believe that it's a necessary evil and that people like Putin are the only ones capable of maintaining order across such a vast nation and potentially bringing back those good old glory days that have taken on almost spiritual significance in the hearts and minds of millions. And then comes Domino 6, Ukraine, the country that dared to go its own way, the country that's challenged the very fabric on which Russia's entire identity was built. A former Soviet republic that was slowly but surely proving it could be a successful, sovereign, and democratic state free of Russian influence and interference. Ukraine was proving that the nations of the near abroad could, in fact, exist outside Russia's orbit, that they could choose political paths that deviated from the Kremlin playbook, that they could build their own identities, a little more Western or European than Russian. Putin couldn't have that. And on a broader level, neither could Russia itself. Had Ukraine been allowed to continue that path, the building blocks on which the Russian Federation was sitting would be pulled out from underneath it, and the whole thing would come toppling down. And so, he orchestrated an invasion, churned out some wishy-washy story about Nazis taking over, and called on his countrymen to follow in the footsteps of those great Soviet heroes who fought the Germans in the 1940s. And people bought it. Hook, line, and sinker, as they say. And why wouldn't they? They'd spent their whole lives being told and taught that they were right, that countries like Ukraine owed them a debt, and that the Russian way was the greatest way. And that brings us to the final domino in the chain, one that hasn't actually fallen yet, the end of the Putin regime. It might not come until the man himself actually dies, given how tightly he's held onto power all these years, but the question is, what happens after that? Many around the world would hope that with Putin gone, Russia would be made to see sense, so to speak, and ease off on its expansionist rhetoric and hostile attitude toward neighboring nations in the NATO alliance. In reality, that's extremely unlikely to happen, because even if Putin died tomorrow, he's just one man. A powerful man for sure, but still, just a man. He could vanish overnight, but the infrastructure, the mythology, the narratives, the identity, and all the other elements that make Russian society what it is would remain. Decades of propaganda wouldn't just go up in smoke. Millions of Russians wouldn't simply wake up and forget everything they've been told all their lives. The ideas that have permeated and punctuated the country's culture wouldn't go anywhere. Russia would still have its imperial past and its Soviet glory days to look back on with glistening eyes. The people would see the state as a necessary oppressor, and it wouldn't be all that difficult for yet another strong man to step into the void and sell the public on the very same ideas Putin did. And let's be honest, that's the scariest part about all this. Putinism may have been named after him, but it could easily outlive Putin himself. To truly get past that, and for Russia to ever actually go about building a better state for itself, would take so much more than the death or removal of a single president. It would require a reckoning of historic proportions and a societal shift the world has almost never seen. In short, it would require a whole new definition of what it means to be Russian. Until that happens, the society will remain systematically broken, with both Russian people and the wider world paying the price. For more insightful analysis of Russian society, the war in Ukraine, and other big issues affecting the world today, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss out on our next release. And we'll see you when the next domino falls.